What do you do when the missile hits and the plane keeps coming? Colonel Jassim al-Dulaimi commanded an Republican Guard air defense battery south of Baghdad on the morning of February 7, 1991. His crew fired an SA-13 shoulder-launched missile at an A-10 Thunderbolt II flying low over Highway 8. The missile struck the tail section. Al-Dulaimi watched the impact through binoculars, a flash, a puff of black smoke. Debris trailing behind the aircraft like confetti. His men cheered. One of them reportedly slapped the launcher operator on the back hard enough to knock him forward. The A-10 pitched left, dropped maybe 200 feet, and leveled out. Then it turned around. It came back toward al-Dulaimi's position with its 30mm cannon already spinning. The sound reached them a full second before the rounds did, that distinctive low moan like a giant clearing its throat. Al-Dulaimi ordered his men into their vehicles. 3 of them didn't make it. If this story hits you the way it hit me, do something with it. Like this video so the algorithm pushes it to someone who gives a damn about these accounts. Subscribe because we dig through documents most channels won't touch. Drop a comment. Tell me what your father or grandfather said about the A-10 if they served in the Gulf. Those stories matter more than mine. Al-Dulaimi survived. He gave a debrief to his division commander that afternoon, and fragments of that report surfaced years later in the Iraqi Perspectives Project, a massive post-war effort by the Institute for Defense Analyses to compile captured Iraqi military documents. The project ran to thousands of pages. Most of it covers strategic decisions, command failures, Saddam's interference in battlefield operations. But scattered through the files sit these smaller reports from field officers. And the A-10 appears in them again and again with a kind of bewildered frustration. Al-Dulaimi's report described the aircraft as impossible to bring down with available weapons. The translators at IDA flagged that phrase specifically because similar language appeared in at least 4 other after-action reports from different units across the Kuwait theater of operations. 4 separate Iraqi commands operating independently used nearly identical words to describe the same aircraft. The A-10 Warthog entered Desert Storm as the plane the Air Force wanted to retire. Too slow, too ugly, too unsophisticated for a modern battlefield supposedly dominated by radar-guided missiles and supersonic interceptors. Pentagon planners had spent the better part of the 1980s trying to kill the program, shift its mission to the F-16, move on to something sleeker. The aircraft's own service branch considered it an embarrassment, a relic from a doctrine nobody believed in anymore. 6 weeks over Iraq changed that calculation permanently. And the men who changed it most convincingly wore Iraqi uniforms. Pierre Sprey called it the ugliest airplane he'd ever helped design, and he meant it as a compliment. Sprey belonged to a small group of Pentagon analysts in the late 1960s who believed the Air Force had lost its mind. The brass wanted Mach 2 interceptors loaded with radar-guided missiles, aircraft so expensive that losing one over Vietnam cost more than an entire battalion's annual budget. Sprey and his allies, John Boyd, Everest Riccioni, a handful of others, argued for something radically different. Cheap and slow, built not to outrun the enemy, but to survive him. The Army had its own problem. Soviet tank divisions in Eastern Europe outnumbered NATO forces roughly 3-1. If the Cold War turned hot across the Fulda Gap, American ground commanders needed close air support that could loiter over the battlefield for hours, absorb punishment from ground fire, and kill armor at close range. The F-4 Phantom could do none of those things well. It flew too fast to identify targets in the weeds, burned fuel at a rate that limited loiter time to minutes, and carried bombs that missed as often as they hit. What the Army wanted, frankly, resembled a flying tank more than an airplane. So the Air Force ran a competition in 1970, reluctantly, under pressure from Congress and the Army both, the AX program. 2 companies submitted prototypes, Northrop and Fairchild Republic. Fairchild's entry looked like someone had welded together spare parts from 3 different aircraft. Twin engines mounted high on the rear fuselage, far apart, so a single hit couldn't kill both. A massive titanium bathtub surrounding the cockpit, 1,200 pounds of armor plating, capable of stopping 23mm rounds, the standard caliber of Soviet anti-aircraft guns. Manual flight controls backing up the hydraulic system, so the pilot could still fly if every hydraulic line got severed. Triple redundant everything. But the heart of the aircraft sat in the nose. The GAU-8 Avenger rotary cannon weighed 4,000 pounds, fully loaded. It fired 30mm depleted uranium rounds at a rate of 3,900 per minute. Each round could penetrate the top armor of a Soviet T-62 tank from over a mile away. The gun produced so much recoil, roughly 10,000 pounds of force, that firing it at full rate actually slowed the aircraft in flight. Engineers had to offset the barrel assembly slightly to port so the firing barrel aligned with the aircraft's centerline, preventing the recoil from yawing the nose off target. The entire airframe flexed when the trigger pulled. Most combat aircraft carry weapons. The A-10 carried a weapon and then built an airplane around it. Fairchild's engineers designed the landing gear, the wing placement, the engine nacelle positions, all of it, to accommodate a gun that outweighed most compact cars. The ammunition drum alone sat directly behind the cockpit and held 1,180 rounds in a cylindrical magazine 5 feet in diameter. Fairchild won the fly-off in January of 1973. The Air Force ordered the aircraft into production with all the enthusiasm of a man buying flood insurance. Generals who'd spent their careers in supersonic cockpits looked at the A-10's top speed of 381 knots and winced. The aircraft couldn't dogfight, couldn't intercept bombers, couldn't even outrun a MiG-21 from the 1950s. Fighter pilots called it the Warthog, and the name stuck precisely because nobody at Tactical Air Command bothered to defend the aircraft's dignity. 715 of them rolled off the Fairchild production line over the next 11 years. They deployed to forward bases in West Germany, England, Alaska, anywhere NATO expected Soviet armor to pour through. Pilots trained to fly at treetop level in weather that grounded every other tactical aircraft in the inventory. They practiced killing tanks in conditions so miserable that the assignment became a career dead end. Then Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. The Air Force expected to lose A-10s by the dozens in the first 72 hours of a European war. That expectation shaped every decision Fairchild's engineers made. They designed an aircraft meant to fly, fight, take a hit, limp home, get patched with speed tape and sheet metal, and fly again before sunrise. Survivability mattered more than performance. Repairability mattered more than elegance. The entire philosophy ran contrary to everything the Air Force valued in a combat aircraft. And it worked because of that, not in spite of it. Start with the engines. General Electric TF-34 turbofans, mounted in pods above the rear fuselage and shielded from below by the horizontal stabilizers. High bypass design, meaning they ran cool compared to afterburning fighter engines. Infrared-guided missiles, the SA-7s and SA-13s filling Iraqi inventories, home on heat. A cooler exhaust signature meant those missiles had to get closer before they could lock. And even if one found its mark, the wide separation between the two engines meant a single warhead couldn't kill both. Lose one engine, fly home on the other. Either way, you flew home. The titanium bathtub protecting the cockpit could absorb hits from 23mm high-explosive incendiary rounds, the most common anti-aircraft caliber in the Soviet and Iraqi arsenals. Fairchild tested it by shooting actual ZSU 23-4 rounds at sample panels from combat ranges. Some panels cracked, most held. The ones that held went into production essentially unchanged. No computer modeling, no simulation. They shot the thing and checked if the pilot would have survived. The same bluntness showed up in the flight control system. Triple redundant hydraulics ran through separate channels on opposite sides of the fuselage, so a single hit couldn't sever all three. If somehow all hydraulic pressure vanished, every line cut, every reservoir drained, the pilot could revert to manual cable and rod controls and still maintain enough authority to land. No other tactical jet in the American inventory offered that capability. The F-16, by contrast, couldn't fly at all without its flight computer. Pull the plug and the aircraft departed controlled flight instantly. Landing gear absorbed abuse that would collapse the struts on an F-15. The A-10 could operate from damaged runways, taxiways, stretches of highway, tires designed for rough fields, maintenance panels accessible without ladders or specialized equipment, because in a NATO war, the ground crews might be working under artillery fire with hand tools. Every feature traded grace for grit. The aircraft couldn't climb fast, couldn't turn tight at altitude, couldn't run from anything with an afterburner. But it could soak up damage that would send any other airplane in the inventory spiraling into the dirt. The Iraqis discovered this on day one. So, what did the Iraqis have waiting for them? More anti-aircraft artillery than any country on Earth, except the Soviet Union itself. Saddam Hussein spent 8 years fighting Iran, and the primary lesson he drew from that war concerned air power. Iranian F-14s and F-4s had savaged his ground forces in the early months of 1980, and he swore it would never happen again. By 1990, Iraq fielded roughly 7,000 anti-aircraft guns and 6,000 surface-to-air missile launchers organized into an integrated network modeled directly on Soviet doctrine. French-built Roland systems covered medium altitude, while Soviet SA-6 gainful batteries handled the upper envelope. And down low, where the A-10 lived, thousands of ZSU-23-4 Shilka self-propelled guns and shoulder-fired SA-7s created a belt of fire so thick that coalition planners referred to it internally as the Super MEZ, short for Missile Engagement Zone. One Air Force intelligence officer described the Kuwait theater's low-altitude environment as essentially uninhabitable for fixed-wing aircraft. His word, uninhabitable. The network fed from a centralized command structure linking early warning radars across Iraq to sector operations centers staffed by officers trained in Odessa and Moscow. French Thompson CSF radars provided the backbone for target acquisition, and Soviet P-18 spoon rest units filled gaps at lower altitudes. The entire system communicated through buried landlines rather than radio, making it resistant to electronic jamming. Iraqi air defense crews had practiced against real targets for nearly a decade, shooting down Iranian jets with enough regularity to develop real institutional competence. Against fast movers like the F-15E and F-16, the network posed serious problems. Against something flying at 300 knots below 2,000 feet, fat, loud, straight-winged, pulling up repeatedly to re-attack the same target, the network should have been devastating. Coalition air planners knew this. The original Desert Storm Air Tasking Order kept A-10s away from the heaviest concentrations of Iraqi air defenses during the first 48 hours. F-117 stealth fighters and Tomahawk cruise missiles would suppress the radar network first. F-4G Wild Weasels would kill the SAM sites. Only then would the Warthogs go to work on armor in the open desert, where the threat environment had been softened to something survivable. That sequence mattered enormously. The A-10 could take a punch, but nobody wanted to test that capability against the full weight of Saddam's air defense fortress all at once. The sequence held for about 2 days. 144 A-10s deployed to 3 bases across Saudi Arabia and Turkey between August and December of 1990. By January 15th, that number climbed to 165, the single largest concentration of Warthogs ever assembled outside the continental United States. 21 more arrived from reserve and guard units, their pilots older, many of them former active-duty flyers who'd chosen the quieter life of weekend warriors. Those guard pilots averaged more stick time in the A-10 than their active-duty counterparts. Some had been flying the airframe for a decade. The Air Force treated them like an afterthought anyway. Pre-war briefings at Riyadh focused on the F-15E Strike Eagle, the F-111F Aardvark, the F-117 Nighthawk. Precision platforms, sexy hardware. The A-10 community received its targeting assignments late, often incomplete, sometimes contradictory. Warthog squadrons operated from King Fahd International Airport, and forward strips so austere that pilots joked they'd finally found the kind of airfields the aircraft had been designed for. Crumbling concrete in the middle of nowhere, exactly like a bombed-out NATO taxiway in West Germany. Nobody in Riyadh predicted what came next. The A-10 flew 8,775 combat sorties during Desert Storm. It maintained a mission-capable rate of 95.7%, the highest of any aircraft in the theater, including platforms costing 4 times as much per airframe. That number still irritates me more than it should, because the Air Force spent 2 decades trying to retire this airplane and replace it with the F-35, an aircraft that has never once demonstrated a mission-capable rate above 85% in operational conditions. Bureaucracies remember what they want to remember. The Warthog squadrons flew around the clock. Dawn missions targeted armor concentrations identified by overnight reconnaissance. Midday sorties struck artillery positions, logistics convoys, command bunkers. Late afternoon flights hunted mobile Scud launchers in the western desert, a task the A-10 performed poorly but attempted anyway because every available airframe got thrown at the Scud problem after missiles started falling on Tel Aviv. Night missions, technically beyond the aircraft's design envelope, since early A-10s lacked forward-looking infrared pods, happened regardless, with pilots using parachute flares and burning vehicles as reference points. Sortie turnaround times dropped below 3 hours. Ground crews at King Fahd reloaded ammunition, patched holes, swapped hydraulic lines, and launched the same aircraft twice in a single shift. The maintenance doctrine Fairchild had built into the airframe 15 years earlier. Those accessible panels, those common parts, that tolerance for rough handling, paid dividends measured in combat sorties per day. An A-10 could absorb battle damage that grounded an F-16 for a week, take 6 hours of wrench work, and fly again carrying a full combat load. The aircraft destroyed more than 900 Iraqi tanks, 2,000 military vehicles, and 1,200 artillery pieces during the 43-day air campaign. No other platform came close. The F-111F killed more individual tanks per sortie using laser-guided bombs, but flew a fraction of the missions. Volume and persistence decided the outcome. The ugly airplane that no general wanted to champion became the single most destructive weapons system of the war. The Iraqis noticed before the Americans did. 0630 hours, February 26, 1991. Captain Eric Salomonson banked his A-10 over the coastal highway north of Kuwait City and saw what looked like a parking lot stretching to the horizon. Bumper to bumper. Tanks, troop carriers, stolen Mercedes sedans, fire trucks, buses packed with Iraqi soldiers trying to flee north toward Basra. The column extended for miles along Highway 80, and nothing in it moved faster than a walking pace. Salomonson rolled in from 1,500 feet. At that altitude, the details sharpened into something almost unbearable. Individual soldiers scrambling out of vehicles, muzzle flashes from small arms pointed uselessly skyward, a man standing on the roof of a civilian bus waving a white cloth. The GAU-8 fired for 2 seconds. 70 rounds of depleted uranium tore through the engine block of a T-72 at the head of the column, and the tank lurched sideways across both lanes, sealing the road. Everything behind it stopped. Salomonson pulled up, circled, and came back for the second pass. Then the third, then the fourth. His wingman worked the opposite end. Between the two of them, they created a kill box roughly 400 meters long with no exit in either direction. The smell of aviation fuel and burning rubber climbed into the cockpit even through the environmental seals, a detail Salomonson mentioned in his debrief and never discussed publicly again. Other A-10 flights stacked up behind them, waiting their turn like aircraft in a holding pattern over O'Hare. Flight lead passed targeting coordinates by radio, and each pair of Warthogs took a fresh section of highway. The process ran continuously for 14 hours. By nightfall on the 26th, the column had ceased to exist as a military formation. Scattered groups of Iraqi soldiers walked north through the desert on foot, abandoning everything: rifles, helmets, boots, personal documents. Coalition aircraft left them alone. A-10 pilots later described a strange guilt about the highway missions, distinct from anything they felt attacking dug-in Republican Guard divisions. Against entrenched armor, the engagement felt like combat. Against the highway column, it felt like something else. The Iraqi soldiers trapped on Highway 80 belonged mostly to regular Army conscript units, not Republican Guard. Many had thrown away their weapons before the first A-10 arrived. The distinction mattered to the pilots even if it changed nothing about their orders. Simultaneously, 40 miles west, a second column died on Highway 8 between Kuwait City and Basra. This one carried heavier armor, T-72s from the Hammurabi Division, elite Republican Guard crews who fought back with coordinated anti-aircraft fire. ZSU, 23 4s in the column, opened up on every pass, and A-10 pilots reported tracers so dense the air looked solid. Captain Rob Givens took 14 rounds through his right wing on a single pass over Highway 8 and kept flying. His hydraulic pressure dropped to 0 in the right system. The backup held. He completed 3 more attack runs before returning to base with a wing that looked, in his crew chief's assessment, like someone had gone after it with a pickaxe. Givens flew again the next morning in a different airframe. The raw mathematics of those 2 days stagger even now. A-10 squadrons expended over 19,000 rounds of 30mm ammunition against the highway columns alone. Maverick missile stocks ran dry by midday on the 27th, forcing pilots to rely entirely on the gun and cluster munitions for the final 8 hours of the engagement. Ground crews back at King Fahd stripped Mavericks from aircraft undergoing maintenance and bolted them onto outbound jets, cannibalizing their own fleet to keep the highway interdiction running. The supply chain buckled but held. Iraqi losses along the 2 highways remained difficult to quantify precisely because so many vehicles burned beyond identification. Post-war survey teams counted wreckage for weeks. The commonly cited figures, 900 tanks, 2,000 vehicles, 1,200 artillery pieces destroyed by A-10s across the entire war, draw heavily from Highway 80 and Highway 8, where the bulk of Iraqi heavy equipment died in a 48-hour window. American losses during those 2 days of concentrated carnage amounted to 5 A-10s damaged, 0 shot down, 0 pilots killed. All 5 were recovered, repaired, and returned to service. The Iraqi General Staff filed their first formal assessment of the A-10 on February 28th. Lieutenant Robert Heheman nursed his A-10 back to King Fahd on one engine, the right nacelle trailing a rope of black smoke visible for 20 miles. An SA-16 had detonated 6 feet behind the exhaust, shearing the turbine blades clean and punching shrapnel through the tail section. The left engine ran fine. He landed without declaring an emergency because, in his words, the airplane didn't seem to think anything serious had happened. The airframe invited this kind of attitude. Captain Kim Campbell took a direct hit from a Roland missile over Baghdad on February 15th. The blast severed both hydraulic systems entirely. Primary and backup gone. The flight controls locked. Campbell switched to manual reversion, a backup mode that connected the stick directly to the control surfaces through steel cables, bypassing hydraulics altogether. No other jet in the American inventory offered that option. She flew the aircraft for an hour on manual reversion, a mode so physically demanding that simulator instructors told students to expect maybe 15 minutes before arm fatigue made precise control impossible. Campbell landed at a forward strip with both arms shaking so badly she couldn't unstrap her own harness. Ground crews counted 300 holes in the fuselage. The crew chief photographed the damage, and those photographs circulated through every A-10 squadron in theater within 48 hours. Morale, already high, became something closer to defiance. Captain Paul Johnson lost his entire right horizontal stabilizer to anti-aircraft fire over the Medina Division on February 24th. Not damaged, removed. The stabilizer separated from the aircraft and tumbled away. Johnson maintained controlled flight using asymmetric thrust and what remained of his elevator authority, compensating for the missing control surface through engine power adjustments so precise they bordered on absurd. He covered 90 miles to the nearest friendly strip and put the aircraft down without further incident. The engineering reasons for this resilience trace back to Fairchild's original stress calculations. The A-10's wing spar ran as a single piece of titanium through the fuselage, meaning you could lose an entire wing panel outboard of the landing gear, and the remaining structure would still carry flight loads. The twin engines sat high and apart, separated by enough fuselage that a single hit almost never killed both. fuel tanks filled with reticulated polyurethane foam that suppressed explosions on penetration, a technology borrowed from racing cars, of all places. The cockpit bathtub weighed 1,200 pounds of titanium armor capable of stopping 23mm rounds, which meant ZSU-23-4 fire, the most common threat at low altitude, couldn't kill the pilot even on a direct pass. Across the entire war, the Iraqis hit A-10s with everything they had. SA-7s, SA-13s, SA-16s, Rolands, ZSU fire, small arms, even a reported RPG strike during one low pass over entrenched infantry. 70 A-10s took combat damage. 5 sustained damage severe enough to be classified as beyond repair. 0 pilots died from enemy fire in the cockpit. The titanium bathtub held every single time. Fairchild Republic went bankrupt in 1987 and never saw its airplane fight. The engineers who designed that bathtub, who argued for every extra pound of titanium against accountants demanding weight savings, received their vindication in a war fought 4 years after the company ceased to exist. The Iraqis drew their own conclusions about that bathtub. Fast jets terrified nobody on the ground. An F-16 passed overhead at 400 knots and vanished before the brain could process what happened. The bomb arrived, the explosion killed, but the aircraft itself registered as an abstraction, a sound, a shadow, then nothing. Iraqi prisoners captured during the ground offensive described F-16 strikes as impersonal. Like weather. The A-10 operated differently. It came in slow. 300 knots on an attack run, sometimes slower, hanging in the air at altitudes where individual soldiers could see the pilot's helmet, the shark-mouth nose art, the dark eye of the gun barrel. And then came the sound. The GAU-8's firing report reached the ground after the rounds had already arrived. Depleted uranium hitting steel at 3,300 feet per second travels faster than its own noise. So, the sequence went like this. First, the impacts. A hammering vibration felt through the soles of your boots if you stood on a vehicle. Then, the sound, a tearing belch so low-pitched it rattled chest cavities. Iraqi soldiers called it different things. The accounts collected by American intelligence teams after the ceasefire used words that translate roughly to the moan, the saw, the ripping. One Republican Guard sergeant from the Tawakalna division described it as the sound a building makes when it falls on you. Not the crash, but the groan just before. The psychological dimensions of low-altitude attack aviation fascinate me in a way I can't fully articulate, because every tactical manual written since 1945 treats morale effects as secondary to kill counts, subordinate, almost embarrassing to quantify. Yet the Iraqi surrender rate in sectors patrolled by A-10s ran measurably higher than in sectors covered exclusively by fast jets and artillery. And nobody at Central Command seems to have studied why with any rigor. Brigadier General Salah Aboud Mahmoud commanded the 26th Infantry Division in the Kuwaiti theater. His division surrendered largely intact on February 25th after sustained A-10 attacks over 3 days. Mahmoud told American debriefers that his men stopped fighting not because of casualties, losses remained moderate, but because the aircraft refused to leave. The thing circled, came back, watched. Fast jets struck and disappeared, granting psychological intervals where a soldier could convince himself the danger had passed. The A-10 denied that mercy. It loitered overhead for 40 minutes at a time, selecting targets with visible deliberation, and the slow, grinding patience of the thing broke men who had survived 8 years of Iranian human wave assaults without flinching. The records contain one detail that cuts through everything else. Multiple Iraqi units reported soldiers covering their ears before covering their bodies. They feared the sound more than the shrapnel. So, what happens when every redundancy fails at once? April 7, 2003. 12 years after the Gulf War proved the Warthog could survive anything Iraq threw at it, Captain Kim Campbell flew her A-10 over Baghdad in a different war against the same enemy. The mission called for close air support near Baghdad International Airport, where Republican Guard units and Fedayeen fighters had dug in along the southern perimeter. Campbell rolled in on a concentration of troops and vehicles at 800 feet, low enough to see faces, low enough that every gun on the ground could see her. She pulled off target and felt the aircraft shudder like something had grabbed it by the tail. An optically guided surface-to-air missile, the type remains disputed in official reports, detonated directly beneath the fuselage. Shrapnel ripped through the horizontal stabilizer, punctured both hydraulic lines, and severed the connections to the flight control system in a single catastrophic instant. The stick went dead in her hand. Not sluggish, not heavy. Dead. Both hydraulic systems read 0. The aircraft began an uncommanded roll to the right, nosing toward the Baghdad suburbs at 400 feet above the ground. Campbell had roughly 2 seconds to make a decision that every A-10 pilot rehearsed in simulators, but almost nobody expected to execute in combat. She reached down and flipped the manual reversion switch. The cables caught. Steel wires running from the cockpit to the ailerons and elevators took the full aerodynamic load, and the stick came alive again, barely. Manual reversion demanded physical force that turned routine flight inputs into a full-body effort. Banking required both hands on the stick and core strength that left her arms burning within minutes. The aircraft responded, but slowly, grudgingly, like steering a car with no power steering at highway speed while someone piled sandbags on the hood. She leveled the wings. She climbed. Baghdad fell away beneath her. The flight back to Ahmed al-Jaber Air Base in Kuwait took roughly an hour. Every minute of that hour, Campbell fought the aircraft for basic control authority while her wingman flew formation alongside, reading off airspeed and altitude callouts because her instruments had gone unreliable. Landing on manual reversion meant no nose-wheel steering, limited braking, approach speeds higher than normal, because precise speed control required hydraulic trim she no longer possessed. She flew the approach manually, touched down on the centerline, and rolled to a stop using differential braking and the emergency accumulator. Ground crews watched the aircraft taxi in with hydraulic fluid streaming from both sides of the fuselage like blood from a wounded animal. When they counted the holes, they stopped at 300. The crew chief, who inspected the tail section, reported damage so extensive he could see daylight through the empennage from 6 separate angles. His phrase for it, relayed through squadron channels, described holes you could crawl through. Campbell climbed out of the cockpit, unable to unclench her hands. Her forearms had cramped into fists from 60 minutes of wrestling the manual reversion system. A flight surgeon pried her fingers open one at a time. She flew again the next day. 1,400 Iraqi officers underwent formal debriefing by American intelligence teams between March and June of 1991. The transcripts fill 11 binders in the Defense Intelligence Agency archive, most declassified in 2004, some with redactions heavy enough to black out entire pages. The consistent thread across rank, branch, and unit type concerns one aircraft. Iraqi officers respected the F-15E Strike Eagle, which dropped more precision munitions than any other platform, and the F-111, which owned the Knight, and the B-52, whose carpet bombing shattered entire brigade positions in minutes. They feared the A-10. Colonel Qadir Hassan al-Samarrai commanded an armored battalion in the Hammurabi Division, Saddam's most elite Republican Guard formation. His debriefing transcript runs 19 pages. He spends 4 of them on the A-10 exclusively. Al-Samarrai told his interrogators that his tank crews developed a specific protocol for A-10 attacks that differed from their response to any other aircraft. Abandon the vehicle immediately. Do not attempt to fight from inside armor. The crews had learned through experience that staying buttoned up inside a T-72 during an A-10 gun run meant death, because the depleted uranium penetrators went through the turret roof at angles no Soviet designer had anticipated. His phrase, as translated by the DIA linguist, called the aircraft al-Salib al-Aswad, the Black Cross. The shape of the wings and tail, seen from below against bright sky. Other units used different names. The Tawakalna division called it the Whisperer, which makes no acoustic sense until you understand the sequence. The rounds hit before the sound arrives, so the first warning came as a strange low hiss of metal fragmenting inside the vehicle. Soldiers in the 25th Infantry Division along the Saudi border used a term the translator rendered as the Patient One. referencing the A-10's loitering pattern. Brigadier General Ra'ad al-Hamdani, who commanded the 17th Armored Brigade and later wrote extensively about the war, produced the most analytically rigorous Iraqi assessment of coalition air power. Al-Hamdani categorized threats by what he termed psychological persistence, the duration of fear a weapon system imposed beyond its actual attack window. Fast jets scored low, artillery scored medium, the A-10 scored highest of any system in the coalition inventory, above even the B-52. His reasoning tracked with what General Mahmoud described. The aircraft stayed, watched, and selected its targets. The deliberateness communicated intelligence and intention in a way that random bombardment never could. The official Air Force after-action reports leave something out. The captured Iraqi General Staff documents include a tactical memorandum dated February 22nd, 4 days before the ground war, ordering all frontline units to prioritize engagement of slow-moving twin-engine attack aircraft above all other air targets. The memorandum allocates additional SA-7 and SA-13 missiles specifically to forward infantry positions for this purpose. The Iraqis reorganized their entire low-altitude air defense posture around killing A-10s, pulling shoulder-fired missile teams from rear area duties and pushing them to the front lines where Warthog activity concentrated. It failed. The reallocation created gaps in rear area air defense coverage that F-15Es and F-16s exploited for the remainder of the air campaign, destroying supply depots and command bunkers that had previously enjoyed adequate missile protection. The Iraqi attempt to solve the A-10 problem made every other problem worse. The DIA summary document uses a word that appears nowhere else in the Gulf War intelligence archive when describing Iraqi officer attitudes toward the A-10. The word is dread. The retirement order sat in a manila folder on a desk at Air Combat Command Headquarters, Langley, Virginia. Dated March 1993, less than 2 years after the Gulf War ceasefire. The ink on the DIA debriefings hadn't dried, the captured Iraqi memoranda still awaited full translation, and the United States Air Force had already decided the A-10 needed to die. The logic ran like this. The Cold War ended, budgets shrank, and every airframe competed for survival against every other airframe. The A-10 lacked a constituency among generals who had built careers in air superiority fighters. It carried no advanced avionics worth defending in procurement hearings. It couldn't go supersonic, couldn't self-escort, couldn't deliver standoff precision munitions from 40,000 feet, and it certainly couldn't make war look clean on CNN, where congressional appropriators felt comfortable. The F-35 Joint Strike Fighter, still a PowerPoint presentation in 1993, not yet bent metal, promised to do everything the A-10 did while also doing everything else. One aircraft to replace an entire inventory. The savings looked irresistible on spreadsheets that never smelled like hydraulic fluid and cordite. They tried in 93. Congress blocked it. They tried again in 2001. Congress blocked it. They tried in 2014 with particular ferocity. Air Force Chief of Staff General Mark Welsh telling the Senate Armed Services Committee that retiring the A-10 fleet would save $3.7 billion over 5 years. Senator Kelly Ayotte asked Welsh a single question that the transcripts record him struggling to answer. What aircraft in the current inventory can survive the damage an A-10 routinely absorbs and continue flying? Welsh pivoted to capability briefs about the F-35's sensor fusion. Ayotte asked the question again. He did not answer it again. Nobody mentions this in those budget hearings. Every attempt to retire the A-10 coincided with an active combat deployment where the aircraft proved irreplaceable. The 93 proposal came during Somalia operations. The 2014 push came while A-10s flew daily sorties against Islamic State positions in Iraq and Syria. The same Iraqi desert, the same low-altitude mission profile, a different generation of pilots sitting in the same titanium bathtub. The enemy couldn't kill it. SA-7s, SA-13s, SA-16s, optically guided missiles, radar-guided missiles, concentrated barrages of 57mm anti-aircraft fire. The Iraqis threw everything in their inventory at the Warthog and produced exactly 0 shoot-downs during Desert Storm. Not one. The Pentagon nearly accomplished what the entire Iraqi military could not. Pierre Sprey asked in 2005 what he thought about the Air Force's repeated attempts to retire his airplane, said something the interviewer described as unprintable, followed by 4 words that were, "They need it ugly." He meant something specific. The A-10 survived not because generals championed it, but because ground troops demanded it. Army sergeants and Marine lieutenants who called in close air support and wanted the aircraft that stayed low and slow, that refused to leave. The Joint Terminal Attack Controllers who worked the radios in Fallujah and Kandahar and the Korangal Valley filed after-action reports that read like love letters to an aircraft the Air Force kept trying to bury. One JTAC report from 2009, forwarded through Army channels to the Senate Armed Services Committee during yet another retirement debate, contains a sentence that stops you cold. "When we hear the engines, we stop being afraid. The A-10 fleet stands at 281 airframes as of 2025. Average age, 42 years. Some of these aircraft carried ordnance over Iraq in 1991, and again in 2003 and again in 2014. 3 wars, same airframe, different pilots sitting in the same seat. The titanium bathtub doesn't corrode. The wings have been reskinned. The engines swapped twice. The avionics upgraded from analog gauges to glass cockpits with targeting pods that Pierre Sprey's original design never anticipated. The GAU-8 remains unchanged because nobody has built anything better. The Air Force announced a phased retirement beginning in 2022, drawing down squadrons at Moody, Davis-Monthan, Osan. This time, Congress didn't block it entirely. The F-35 had finally reached operational status in sufficient numbers to theoretically absorb the close air support mission, though the word theoretically carries about 42 years of institutional weight behind it. The F-35 costs roughly $36,000 per flight hour. The A-10 costs roughly $6,000. The F-35's 25mm cannon carries 180 rounds and has experienced chronic accuracy problems documented in operational test reports. The GAU-8 carries 1,150 rounds of depleted uranium and puts 80% of them inside a 40-foot circle from a slant range of 4,000 feet. Colonel Qadir Hassan al-Samarrai, the Hammurabi Division officer who devoted 4 pages of his debriefing to the Black Cross, survived the war and the subsequent Shia uprising and the American invasion of 2003. He gave a second interview to American intelligence officers in April 2003, 12 years after his first debriefing, in a different war, in a country that had changed beyond recognition. The interviewer asked if Iraqi tactical doctrine had adapted to counter the A-10 in the intervening decade. Al-Samarai's response, as recorded in the translated transcript, "We studied it extensively. We developed new dispersal patterns, new camouflage protocols, new engagement sequences for shoulder-fired missiles. Then the war started and none of it mattered. The aircraft absorbed our missiles and kept shooting." Sources conflict on what happened to al-Samarai after 2004. One DIA file places him in Amman, Jordan. Another references a death certificate from Tikrit dated 2006. The records don't reconcile. Kim Campbell retired from the Air Force as a colonel in 2023. Her A-10, tail number 780621, flew combat missions for another 16 years after she landed it on manual reversion with 300 holes in the airframe. Maintenance crews at Bagram logged it operational through 2019. The aircraft outlasted every Iraqi weapon fired against it, and it outlasted the Pentagon budget analysts who tried to ground it, the procurement officers who promised a replacement. The plane that wouldn't die kept not dying, long after the men who named it stopped caring whether it lived. The Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum requested an A-10 for permanent display in 2021. The Air Force offered tail number 780621, Campbell's aircraft, the Baghdad Survivor. It sits in a restoration facility in Suitland, Maryland, awaiting prep for exhibition. The maintenance logs travel with the airframe. per museum policy. Page 11 of the April 2003 entry, filled out in ballpoint pen by a crew chief whose signature is illegible, lists the repair work performed after Campbell's flight. 317 patched holes, 2 hydraulic systems replaced, 1 horizontal stabilizer rebuilt from salvage parts. Estimated repair time logged at the bottom of the page, 72 hours.